I don't know if folks saw the big news today is that the U.S. national security strategy has been altered to change the way the United States speaks about the European Union. And we know that even though Trump is doing exactly, in a lot of ways, what the mainstream of imperialism would want, Donald Trump is threatening war against Venezuela. Donald Trump has bombed Iran. He hasn't made a peace deal with Russia yet. It's looking good like that may happen, but it hasn't happened yet. But yet there is a section of our ruling class that is fighting Donald Trump desperately. I mean, they want him out of there. They think he is the most dangerous thing they've ever seen. We also know that around the world, there is a big division among the elite. You know, the political crisis in South Korea that we've been following. It seems like every time a new one of the political party takes power, they want to put the previous party into prison. You know, and that there's this, you know, this situation that we've talked about, and it's, you know, people from the Conservative Party are all being locked up, ministers in particular, because there seems to be a fight going on in South Korean politics. It's very intense. In Germany, there's talk of outlawing the Alternative for Deutschland, AfD party. In France, they would like to block the daughter of the National Front founder, this woman who is the face of the new right, Marine Le Pen. They want to block her from being able to run in the elections. Meanwhile, Candace Owens is revealing and you know, kind of going to war against Macron, the French leader, and making all kinds of accusations. We're living in very interesting times, and on these streams, we do our best to try and make sense of all of this. That's what we do here on these streams. And there are a couple different ways to understand all of this. And that's really the value of these streams. I don't think people come on here to get the news necessarily, though we do give a lot of updates, especially when it comes to international developments. People come on here to get analysis, to understand not just what is happening, but why it is happening and how the world works. That's what makes this channel so special. And our analysis has many layers to it. And the theme tonight is the shadow war among the global elite. And tonight I'm going to talk about some subtle and not so subtle differences within the American elite and what it means. And I want to start with Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, right? Because Donald Trump, I don't know if you noticed, Donald Trump made a big point of having a portrait of Roosevelt on display at the White House. Mamdani praised him for it. Well, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the only American president that there is a fully documented attempted military coup against. Right? Now, Republicans will often try to claim, or Democrats will often try to claim that January 6th was a coup, but it wasn't, right? There was no way that, you know, the mob of Trump supporters were going to be able to cancel and nullify the election results by running around the Capitol dressed up in a silly costume. You know, and, you know, there are other presidents. I mean, you know, many people interpret the assassination of John F. Kennedy as a coup, but it's not documented to be such. But in 1933, it is well documented that President Roosevelt was facing the threat of a military coup. It was called the business plot. And there were congressional hearings about the business plot. Smedley Butler of the U.S. Marine Corps revealed the fact that a number of high-ranking wealthy people centered around the Morgans, J.P. Morgan, had approached him about a military coup to remove Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt very much could tell that he was facing very solid opposition. There were people who wanted to overthrow him. And they weren't just Republicans, right? The American Liberty League was formed, headed by Al Smith, who was a Democrat in New York City. Al Smith formed the American Liberty League, and he announced there can be only one capital for America, Washington or Moscow. And he considered Roosevelt to be a communist sympathizer. And it was the National Association of Manufacturers, factory owners, the Morgans, the owners of General Electric, industrialists. It was also Henry Ford and others who very much wanted to oust President Roosevelt. The most blatant attempt was apparently the 1933 attempted coup, but they wanted to oust him from the time of that until his death. And why? Well, the issue was that there was a huge amount of labor unrest in the United States at the time, and it was the Great Depression. The economy was not doing very well. And there was a rising industrial union movement, and that industrial union movement was led by communists who were aligned with 1/6 of the planet at the time, which was the Soviet Union. And there was a fear of a communist revolution, but there was also just the more blatant threat, that if these manufacturers like Henry Ford, like J.P. Morgan, like the steel manufacturers, if they were forced to sign agreements with industrial unions, they would lose lots of money. And eventually they did have to sign agreements with industrial unions, and they did lose lots of money. And it was the industrialists who seemed to be Roosevelt's biggest enemies, especially in his second term in office, when he seemed to really strongly embrace the labor movement. But Roosevelt had some friends that were his friends from long before he was president, even when he was governor of New York. They were family friends going way back. And those friends were the Rockefellers, one of the richest families in American history, probably the richest family in the world if you really dig it up. The estate of John D. Rockefeller, the dynasty that was created by John D. Rockefeller in Standard Oil, that entity, if you want to call it that, they were quite wealthy, and they were for Roosevelt. They liked Roosevelt. And there was a clear economic difference between the Rockefellers that backed Roosevelt and the National Association of Manufacturers that wanted to remove Roosevelt and discussed a military coup about how to overthrow him. And the difference was, where did their money come from? The Rockefellers were oil tycoons, oil monopolists. They made money selling oil all over the world. And they were very much tied in with the British and Great Britain and the City of London. And they sold oil all over the world, and they dominated trade routes, and people bought oil from them. And they used their money not only to run the international oil trade, but to run the international banking system, which was based on oil money. Chase Bank is largely considered a Rockefeller creation. And the Rockefellers supported Roosevelt, whereas the National Association of Manufacturers and the Henry Ford and the steel industry, they didn't like Roosevelt. The Rockefellers weren't going to lose that much because of industrial unions, because they made their money selling oil. And so industrial unions were not considered an immediate threat. Whereas to the National Association of Manufacturers, industrial unions were considered an immediate threat. They would cut into their profits. And it appears that those who wanted to remove Roosevelt wanted to replace him with a president who would crush the industrial unions, outlaw them on the grounds they were communist, and then create lots of military spending, which would create lots of money for industrial manufacturers. And that was what they wanted to do, right? That's what the National Association of Manufacturers wanted. Whereas the Rockefellers, who ended up winning out, their feeling was throw a bone to the labor unions. Let the labor unions sign a contract, give people jobs, and that'll cool the class struggle. And that became especially important as Nazi Germany emerged, right? Nazi Germany emerged. There's a lot going around, and somebody asked a question about this, but Nazi Germany, when it comes to Nazi Germany, everybody thinks they know everything, and nobody knows anything, right? People will tell you all kinds of crazy stories about how Hitler was actually Jewish and hated himself for being Jewish. People will tell you all kinds of stories about, about this or that, Hitler's dog, Hitler's cat, Hitler's niece, Hitler's cousin, Hitler's this, Hitler's that, but nobody knows what actually happened. But the big thing was that Hitler put into effect in Germany a lot of economic policies very quickly, and those policies were invented by Hjalmar Schacht. Hjalmar Schacht was a German financier, a banker. Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht. He was a German banker who didn't like the British, but was very, very anti-communist. And he wanted to assert German industrial and economic independence. But he also, at the same time, wanted to defeat the Soviet Union and especially exterminate and extinguish the threat of communist revolution in Germany. And Hjalmar Schacht, when the Nazis took power, they rebuilt the German industry. They stabilized the German economy, with huge amounts of military spending and the creation of a slave labor underclass, putting half the country in military uniforms, the other half in concentration camps. And one of the big stories is that Hjalmar Schacht, the Nazi economist, was sent to New York, to Washington, to meet with President Roosevelt. When he met with President Roosevelt, he told Roosevelt, Germany will not be repaying any of its debts to American banks. And that was what Hjalmar Schacht told President Roosevelt. And according to the biography of Hjalmar Schacht, and according to all sources, I mean, there were witnesses to this, Roosevelt laughed. And he said, it serves those Wall Street guys right. He laughed about it. He thought it was funny that Hitler was not going to repay any of the debts that Germany had to British and American banks, that, that Germany under the Nazis had been heavily indebted to German and American banks. And one of the things that Hitler did is when he took power, he nullified it, said, we're not paying you back. And that Roosevelt, in his alliance with the Rockefellers and with the British, they eventually got to the point they considered Nazi Germany to be the greatest threat. Whereas the industrialists, the manufacturers, they considered the Soviet Union to be the greatest threat. And they were very excited about military spending. And so there was a division among our elite, and that the forces that backed Roosevelt, you can call them the New England establishment, the Eastern establishment. It was the old money tied in with the British. The British saw Germany as the main threat. And what's interesting is prior to the rise of Hitler, the Soviet Union had actually been sympathetic to industrialists, right? During the early 1930s, right? 1928 is the year that Stalin became the leader of the Communist International, right? There had been the fight, Bukharin had represented the rightist opposition. He'd been defeated. Before that, Trotsky had represented what they called the leftist opposition. He'd been defeated. And Stalin took power and solidified his leadership of the Communist International in 1928. And in 1928, at the 6th World Congress of the Communist International, the slogan was class against class. And with the slogan class against class, the Soviet Communist Party and the Communist International announced what they called the third period. The third period. And they said that there had been a revolutionary upheaval immediately following World War I. That was the first period. And then there had been the Roaring '20s, the period of capitalist stabilization. But now, with the collapse of the stock market coming, right? 1929 is when the stock market collapsed in the United States, but the economy was already sinking in Europe at the time. They declared this was the beginning of what they called the third period of the Communist International, the third period. And this would be the period of socialist revolution, and it would be the period of socialist construction, right? And in the Soviet Union, Stalin launched the 5-year economic plans to build the Soviet Union into an industrial country. And around the world, the communist parties focused on opposing social democrats. They argued that social democrats were what they called social fascists. And in Britain, the communists focused on opposing the British Labour Party. In America, the communists focused on opposing the Socialist Party and the American Federation of Labor and Norman Thomas. And at the same time that the communists were going around opposing social democrats as the main danger, Stalin was courting the industrialists. Henry Ford went to the Soviet Union and was contracted by the Soviet government to help the Soviet Union set up its car industry. General Electric was contracted. The Morgans were contracted by the Soviet Union to help the Soviet Union build power plants. And in fact, they built the world's largest power plant, the Dnieper Dam. Fred Koch, the father of the Koch brothers, right? He was a chemist in the United States who worked in the petroleum gasoline industry, and he'd been sued by every major oil company. And Stalin hired him to come to the Soviet Union and set up the Soviet oil industry. And it was in this first period, in the third period, from 1928 to 1935, the communists focused on opposing social democrats, and Stalin courted industrialists. And in fact, the term captain of industry, many people say, I cannot find confirmation of this, but many people say that term may have been coined by Stalin himself, right? And that he saw these industrial manufacturers as allies of the Soviet Union. And there's quotes from Stalin where he says that, Bolshevism is the combination of the Russian revolutionary spirit with American efficiency, something like that. And the Soviet Union was aligned with industrialists, and social democracy was seen as the main threat. And social democracy was very much funded by the Rockefellers. And, that's, in the United States, the big social democratic institution was the Rand Corporation. It was like a think tank that was run by the Socialist Party and that now is a major CIA institution. But if you look at the history, the Rand Corporation was set up by the Socialist Party as an anti-communist foreign policy think tank. And the British Labour Party, within the British Labour Party, you had the Fabian Society, led by H.G. Wells and others, that had all kinds of totalitarian schemes. Malthusianism was quite popular among social democrats. H.G. Wells was very much a Malthusian. This notion of overpopulation, we need to drive down the population. And the social democrats and the Rockefellers were seen as the main threat because they were trying to stabilize capitalism with some kind of managerial scheme. And the industrialists were seen as, hey, they just want to make money. They're potential friends of the Soviet Union. And that was the orientation of the Communist Party and of the Communist International in the early 1930s. But it flipped when Hitler took power. When Hitler took power, suddenly the orientation became that fascism was the main threat and that anti-fascist capitalists could be important allies against the fascists. And, it's very interesting, but a lot of people, there's a lot of different analysis that talks of a shadowy elite, right? I mean, obviously, in 1935, Georgy Dimitrov, the leader of the Communist International, he put forward the notion that there was a democratic bourgeoisie and a fascist bourgeoisie. And the job of communists was to boost and align with the democratic bourgeoisie in a popular front or a united front against fascism. But prior to that, there had been other people talking about a division among the elite, right? Aleister Crowley, the occultist, he claimed to be a British intelligence officer. Some people dispute it, but he actually wrote a novel called Moonchild, which was widely circulated. He had a lot of people and a lot of wealthy British people that paid Aleister Crowley to do, mystical ceremonies with them and other. And Aleister Crowley, his novel Moonchild, told the story of World War I and claimed that World War I was actually a fight between two groups of wizards, the white wizards and the black wizards, and that the governments of Europe were controlled by various wizards, and the black wizards ran the German government, and the white wizards ran the British government, and that's what World War I was really about. Now, obviously, that's a little bit of a bunch of nonsense, but that's the way he saw it. And Aleister Crowley was somebody who did, was paid by a lot of wealthy people to do magical ceremonies for them and, listen to their life stories and offer them advice and, all of that. He probably had some insights into the real divisions among the European elite that existed. Now, his claim that it was all a big fight between wizards, it's a little bit silly, but, it's not as silly as you might think. Obviously, I'm not proclaiming that there's secretly magic controlling the world. But what is interesting is that wealthy people tend to engage in occultism, right? And I've written about the Aquarian conspiracy. Al Gore had Marilyn Ferguson, the occultist, whispering in his ear for many years. Marilyn Ferguson was this very famous, famous woman who claimed to have psychic powers, who, was having events at the Clinton White House, was very close to Al Gore, and was very much tied in with the CIA and the Stanford Research Institute. Apparently, she was being paid by the CIA money to do her psychokinetic or whatever research. And that CIA was paying a lot of money to people who thought they were psychics. And the Stanford Research Institute in California was where they were doing it. And one of these people tied to the Stanford Research Institute, Marilyn Ferguson, was Al Gore's personal spiritual advisor, right? And yes, people talk about Rasputin and the Tsar's family. And, so these things do go on. And right now, Marianne Williamson, right? She is a major candidate for president, right, in the Democratic Party. Before that, she was made famous by Oprah. And she's just one of these mystical occult, type people who, does psychic stuff for rich people. And so the notion that, the rich people who hired Aleister Crowley to do his mystical occult stuff for them, and, that they might know about divisions among the rich and powerful and other people who hired other people to do their mystical occult stuff. That's not exactly far-fetched, right? You don't have to write some kind of horror story, right? You don't have to write some horror novel, but, the notion that rich people are getting together in secret clubs and engaging in, weird rituals, and they pay different people, and there's rival rich people who pay different people to do their occult mystical stuff. That's not that outrageous, actually. Look at the 2004 election. We had John Kerry and George W. Bush. They ran for president, and they were both members of the same club at Yale, the Order of Skull and Bones, the Order 322, Skull and Bones, one of the top 3 secret societies at Yale. And you look at that, and that is an occult mystical thing. They've got dead Native American bodies in their lodge. They do all kinds of crazy stuff. And yeah, Nancy Reagan was always hiring astrologers and all of that. So what Aleister Crowley put forward in his fictional novel, Moonchild, that World War I was actually a fight between the black wizards and the white wizards. That sounds a little silly on the surface, but if you understand it's a fight between rich people, right? If it's a fight between different factions among the elite, the German capitalist ruling class that was grouped around the Kaiser, that was tied in with the German manufacturers, with the Krupps, with the Tysons, with the Schachts, and the British industrialists and the British manufacturers that were grouped around, the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the DuPonts and the American elite. And they all had mystical, weird gurus they were going to talk about their life problems and read their palms and do stuff for them. What Crowley is putting forward, I mean, while it's obviously a fantastical story, it makes sense if you understand the way rich people operated, right? And people even talk about like psychoanalysis is similar. What occultism, was or is for many rich people. Psychoanalysis is a similar thing, right? They sit on the couch, they have the psychoanalyst talk to them about their life and help them make life goals and relive their childhood memories. And, and that's not that different from what the occult folks do, right? So all of this, that was Crowley's, notion, was that it was a fight between a group of wizards. But then, right, going back to the 1800s, you had a lot of Roman Catholics, a lot of Catholic conservatives, talking about the Illuminati and the Bavarian Illuminati. That was a really common theme among Roman Catholics, right? Is that you had a lot of Catholics who felt that there was a conspiracy against the Catholic Church, who very much felt that the French Revolution and the various uprisings were being engineered by some kind of elite. And they specifically called out Masonry. There are many papal statements from the Vatican condemning the practice of Freemasonry. They viewed Masonic lodges and what they taught as being a threat to the Catholic Church. And apparently at one point in Bavaria in like the 1700s, they had arrested some kind of anti-Catholic conspirator group called the Bavarian Illuminati. So starting in like the 1880s, 1890s, you got various Roman Catholic conservatives and anti-communists talking about the Illuminati. And they, and often they were really talking about Masonry. Masonry was openly practiced, and they didn't like Masonry. They claimed Masonry was actually a continuation of the Bavarian Illuminati, and they were talking about some in the elite were part of the Illuminati or part of the Freemasons, and some in the elite were against them. So there's various theories that have floated around, right? You have Crowley and his wizard thing. You have the conservative Catholics and their Masons versus anti-Masons. Or their, Illuminati thing. And then you have in 1935, Georgy Dimitrov saying, well, it's actually, there's the democratic bourgeoisie and the fascist bourgeoisie, right? And that we seek to align, the communists of the world seek to align with the democratic bourgeoisie against the fascist bourgeoisie. And in America, that seemed to line up pretty well. If you read anything that the Communist Party of the United States published during the late 1930s, during the Popular Front period, they saw Roosevelt as their ally, and they saw J.P. Morgan and Henry Ford as their enemy. And they believed that Henry Ford and J.P. Morgan and a lot of the industrialists who they were trying to battle against to create industrial unions, they believed that they, along with Randolph Hearst and some others, that they were part of the fascist bourgeoisie. And they happily aligned themselves with Franklin Roosevelt and the Popular Front, which included the Rockefellers and others who opposed them. And that's very, very interesting. It's very, very interesting when you think about it. And that Roosevelt was very much battling against his own party. Probably the climax of the fight within the United States during the Roosevelt administration came in the months following the 1936 presidential election. This is a very important moment in American history. Go read Labor's Untold Story, and you'll read about this. What happened, right? What happened? Franklin Roosevelt won the 1936 election by a landslide. He was popular because he had created the Works Progress Administration, and he had hired millions of unemployed workers and given them jobs paving roads, giving them jobs building highways. And Roosevelt had hired millions of unemployed people, and that made him very popular. He had legalized labor unions with the Wagner Act of 1935, and that had made him very popular with the labor movement. And there were millions of Americans who felt like Roosevelt had saved them from starving on the street, and they went out and voted for him. Wall Street was very much against Roosevelt, but Roosevelt was popular. And during the 1936 election, Roosevelt, he gave a very powerful speech at Madison Square Garden, which we have actually reprinted. CPI has reprinted in our textbooks because it's so important, right? This is, our We Are City Builders. We've actually reprinted that speech. And in that speech, he does reference the fact that many employers were threatening to lay off their workers if Roosevelt won the 1936 election. They were saying that Roosevelt, if he wins the election, our taxes are going to go up. The unions are going to gain ground. And so you're going to lose your job. We're going to lay you off if Roosevelt wins the election. Now, that's illegal. Right? That is illegal. But they were still doing it. And so Roosevelt won the election by a landslide. And these employers started making good on their threats. They started laying off workers in the aftermath of the 1936 presidential election. And in Akron, Ohio, a group of rubber workers were laid off from the rubber factory in Akron, Ohio. And they said nope, and they occupied their factory. They didn't just go on strike outside the factory. They just refused to leave. They were told they were not going to have jobs anymore. And they said, well, we're not leaving the factory. They occupied the factory, and they called it a sit-down strike, 1936. And after a couple days, the company gave in, and they kept their jobs because they occupied their factory. It was a sit-down strike. They occupied their factory. And then you had in late December of 1936 and January of 1937, you had the Flint sit-down strike, which was considered one of the most important turning points in labor history in America, where these workers occupied their factory. They refused to leave. The police tried to drive them out, and they took the fire hoses from the plant and they mowed down the cops, with the fire hoses and, knocked over all the police. They called it the Battle of Bull's Run. At the time, bull was a slang term for a police officer. So it was the Battle of Bull's Run, where they sprayed all the cops down with fire hoses, and they drove the strikebreakers out of the plant, and the military was sent to Flint, Michigan. And they expected that the military would drive them out of the factory, but the military did the opposite. And it protected them because President Roosevelt had given them the order. And the workers were protected by the military from the police, from the union, or the anti-union thugs and others. And they occupied the factory in Flint, Michigan. And at that point, the United Auto Workers won its first contract with Chrysler. And at that point, the United Auto Workers became a union. And then you had the sit-down strike wave, this explosion of sit-down strikes across the United States. And it was spawned by a division in the ruling class. Roosevelt feared being overthrown. All these industrialists had laid off a bunch of workers after he won. And so President Roosevelt and the White House endorsed industrial action, industrial occupation, sit-down strikes, and all across the United States. The CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, a more radical labor union, was formed because President Roosevelt felt he was being threatened by his own class. And so he mobilized, he said, gave his fireside chats, and he basically gave permission to millions of workers to occupy their factories in 1937, the sit-down strike wave. You can read about it. And that was a fight between the elite, between the ruling class, but the labor unions were on the side of Roosevelt, and the labor unions were led by communists and members of the Communist Party, which was aligned with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's biggest threat was Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany was an influence on a lot of these industrialists. And so there was a division, among the ruling class. Some in the ruling class liked Hitler and hated Roosevelt. Some liked Roosevelt and hated Hitler. And because of that division, you got the explosion of industrial unions in 1937 and the Flint sit-down strike wave. Now, all of this is important. We're talking about divisions among the elite, the global elite. All of this is important, and that Roosevelt aligned himself with the oil bankers and with the British Empire and was against Nazi Germany and was willing to work with the Soviet Union, reluctantly. He wasn't a huge fan of the Soviet Union, but he was willing to tolerate them, willing to align with them against Hitler. Meanwhile, you had many industrialists who liked the Nazis because they had crushed the labor unions. And many industrialists who felt like Hitler, by crushing the labor unions, by getting military spending going, he was a model of what they should adopt. And after the Second World War, that fight didn't go away. Roosevelt died as World War II was ending, and the U.S. economy was booming in the 1950s. But that division among the American elite didn't go away after World War II. But before we go there, I want to talk to you a little bit about Margaret Sanger, because we're talking about the Rockefellers, right? Margaret Sanger was a very, very wealthy woman of Irish descent who lived in New York City and was a communist, socialist in the lead up to World War I. She had a magazine, I think it was called Rebel Woman, and she was a funder of the Industrial Workers of the World and the Socialist Party of New York City. And she was all about birth control, free love. And she distributed birth control, got arrested for doing so. She was all about birth control. And at one point, John D. Rockefeller, he committed a massacre. He was tied to a massacre of workers out in Colorado. So she put out an ad calling for someone to assassinate the Rockefellers, and kill them. And she fled the country. And she set up in Britain. And while she was in Britain, a lot of things happened. World War I broke out. And then the Russian Revolution happened. And she didn't like the Russian Revolution. She didn't like the Soviet Union because it wasn't about sex. It was about socialism. It wasn't about sex, right? The Soviet Union was not the free love, free sex paradise that she wanted. And starting after World War I, Margaret Sanger, this very, very wealthy feminist and communist in New York City, wealthy woman who funded communists, she joined the Neo-Malthusian Society of Britain. And she started getting paid by the Rockefellers to promote birth control and abortion. And she came back to the United States. And with the funding of the Rockefellers, she set up the first birth control clinic in America, in New York City. And she had her organization, it was called the Birth Control League. It's now called Planned Parenthood. And it was all funded by the Rockefeller family because they believed overpopulation was the problem. And she went from being a communist socialist to being a eugenicist. Margaret Sanger, and Hillary Clinton, considers her greatest hero, and she's considered like a feminist icon, Margaret Sanger. But you read her actual writings. She really emphasized the cruelty of charity. She said that if you feed poor people, you're only making it worse, because poor people are poor because they're genetically inferior. And if you feed poor people, then they're able to reproduce. And then you have more poor people that are genetically inferior. And yes, she was not a fan of African Americans either. And there was a man on the board of Planned Parenthood named Lothrop Stoddard, who was a Ku Klux Klan member and a white supremacist, and was very much an advocate of eugenics. And this was all paid for by the Rockefellers. And if you read what was written by Margaret Sanger, she said the problem was not capitalism. It was man's desire to expand. It was humanity itself. Humanity's drive to procreate, humanity's drive to have more. That was the cause of the economic problems. It wasn't that capitalism, an irrational system, is holding back economic growth. It was rather economic growth itself. Growth is bad. That is the Malthusian argument. And if you read what was written by Margaret Sanger in her various pamphlets, she specifically calls out Marxism, saying that Marxism is wrong. The problem is not that we have an economic system where poverty is created by abundance. The problem is just growth itself, that growth is bad. And she made clear that was not Marxism, right? That was not Marxism. Marxism is all about growth. However, it says that that growth is held back by the irrationality of capitalism. Marxism is in favor of growth. She said that growth was inherently bad. And she was paid for by the Rockefellers for saying this. And the Rockefellers were all about Planned Parenthood. What's also interesting is during the 1950s, after World War II, you had the Kinsey Report that was published. The Kinsey Report was considered a groundbreaking text in the sexual revolution in America. And the Kinsey Report was published. And the Kinsey Report was all paid for by the Rockefellers. Alfred Kinsey was a sex researcher from Indiana, and he went around getting all kinds of people's sexual histories and biographies. And he published this book, the Kinsey Report, that was very widely circulated. And it was all paid for by the Rockefellers. And it really shocked middle America. It said homosexuality was a lot more common. And apparently he employed a child molester to carry out his research. There was an actual pedophile who had molested a number of children, who was consulted heavily about the research. And you can read that's a little bit of a scandal that Alfred Kinsey worked closely with and protected this pedophile who was molesting all kinds of children to carry out his research. Regardless, that was the Rockefellers that paid for it. And the Rockefellers were Republicans, but the Republican Party did not like them, and they did not like Joe McCarthy. It's all very, very interesting. It's all very, very interesting. And, I'm talking about the war within the elite. And this is all very interesting. But, there's something that happened even when I was a kid. Even when I was a kid, and I was a kid pretty recently. But even when I was a kid, there were a lot of religious people I knew who would not listen to rock and roll music. They thought rock and roll music was satanic, right? They would only listen to religious music. And there was a very famous incident when the Beatles toured the United States only once, I believe. And when they toured the United States one time during the early 60s, they had to stop because there was so much violence against them. All right. Rock and roll music comes out of the South of the United States. It started with African-American prayer music and Pentecostal prayer music, which eventually gave rise to the blues, etc. And then, you had Elvis Presley, who was a white man who could sing black music. And so, they couldn't play black people on the radio. Elvis sang rock and roll music, which was black. And that's why there's still a lot of hatred for Elvis Presley in the black community, because, he stole black music. As a white man, a white guy, he was able to, play black music and become famous. And that, Elvis Presley himself admitted that his greatest influences were people like Chuck Berry. And it was African-American music that he had largely, stolen to make his music or whatever. But rock and roll was associated with the Southern United States. But the Beatles were British. They were a British rock and roll band. And they toured the United States. They played on the Ed Sullivan Show and made a big splash. And they toured the United States. And when they toured the United States, there was so much violence against them. They refused to ever do it again. There were gunshots fired at them on stage. There were bomb threats at almost every auditorium they played at. The Beatles were considered to be a threat. And rock and roll music had largely been rejected by conservatives anyway, but not anywhere near as much as the Beatles had been, right? You would think that it would be Elvis, you know, it would be American rock and rollers who'd be the most hated. You'd think it would be black performers, right? You know, these racist Southern whites wouldn't want their white kids to go to a concert with black performers, but actually the Beatles are the ones that got this like very, very extreme response from middle America. And part of it revolved around the fact that John Lennon had given an interview where he said he was more popular than Jesus. But he hadn't just said that. If you actually read it, John Lennon had given an interview where he basically, made clear he was not socially conservative. And he also made clear he was not a Bible-believing Christian. He was certainly a religious skeptic, and he made that clear in an interview. And that really made people angry. But there was something more to it than that. It wasn't simply that John Lennon gave an interview stating, religious views that were unpopular. And it wasn't just that they didn't like rock and roll music, because rock and roll had been around for at least a decade before that. It was that the hypnotic quality of rock music had been really amped up by the Beatles. The Beatles, what they were doing with rock and roll, they had figured out ways to make it much more potent, right? And that rock and roll has a hypnotic quality to it, right? And it comes out of Pentecostal prayer music, which actually comes out of African religious traditions, right? And that, these Pentecostal churches, they would pray for 6-7 hours, and they would, sing songs that are very, very repetitive and would go on for quite some time. And they have kind of a hypnotic quality, right? And then out of that, right, you get the blues, you get a lot of black music. And out of that, you eventually get what we call rock and roll. And what makes rock and roll so exciting is a steady beat in the music. It's kind of the repetition of the chords. It has kind of a hypnotic quality. And the Beatles had taken almost scientifically what had happened with American rock and roll music kind of organically, right? American rock and roll music was created by people who were listening to blues, and people before them had listened to Pentecostal and worship music and African-American spirituals, and people before them. But the Beatles, it was almost like someone had sat down scientifically and said, all right, what makes rock and roll music emotionally effective? Why does it hit people the way it does? And they had done research, and they had actually done research and figured out how to make a sound that would really impact people emotionally and really impact people. And that's why, you see those clips of the Beatlemania, right? And all the young women crying and moving back and forth and the mobs of women chasing the Beatles. That wasn't all hype. That actually happened because what the Beatles were doing at their concerts had never been done before. And they had taken rock and roll and what the charm of Elvis, the charm of Buddy Holly and all of that, and they had amped it up. And they didn't do it by themselves. The record companies had done it. Now, a lot of people cite the Tavistock Institute for Social Research as being primarily to blame for this. I don't know if that's true, right? The Tavistock Institute does exist, but there's a lot of malarkey written about them. There's a lot of people who make very outrageous claims about the Tavistock Institute and what it did. I don't know, honestly, right? The Tavistock Institute was a psychological research institute in Britain that was created to do propaganda studies during the Second World War. After the Second World War, it was employed by various, marketing firms to develop advertising and such. And we know that British intelligence, MI6, as well as American intelligence, were doing all kinds of research into mind control and all kinds of stuff, MK Ultra and all of that. And so to what degree or other the Tavistock Institute itself was involved in helping cultivate Beatles music, I don't know. Right. And again, there are a lot of fantastical claims people make. I've seen people say things, for example, they claim that the Frankfurt School guy wrote all the Beatles songs. That's not true. The Beatles wrote their own songs, stuff like that. So you got to be careful whenever the Tavistock Institute comes up, but it really did exist. And there was something about Beatles music that was particularly potent. It was very, very effective. And the Beatles themselves came with a very, very liberal socially liberal, embracing the sexual revolution and embracing drug use, social message. And middle America was very threatened by it. And in particular, it was a lot of the churches that, did the same kind of thing in their church. They had the same kind of hypnotic, Pentecostal thing. And all of a sudden, people are going to a concert where they're having the same kind of music and there's no religion attached to it. Right. And so all of this points to the fact that middle America really rejected the Beatles. The Beatles were why there was a huge mobilization against them from middle America, from conservatives, from not just religious people, but conservatives in general. They really opposed them, but mainstream media really promoted the Beatles and thought the Beatles were very good and there was nothing wrong with them and all of that. There was a fight among the elite. And it all gets very, very interesting. Now, who was supporting the Beatles? Who was opposing them? Why? Well, we don't really know exactly. And again, this is the kind of thing where you have to be careful. If somebody wants to go through this with a fine-tooth comb, they can always find a counterexample, right? There's always somebody in the one category who said the opposite. So you can't exactly be clear about this. But it really gets back to the Korean War. During the Korean War, there were thousands of American GIs who were taken captive. And the overwhelming majority of them apologized for war crimes, signed confessions of war crimes, and became communists. And that horrified America, right? I mean, it was just considered to be shocking, right? You look at that. And that's when, there was the movie The Manchurian Candidate that came out. That was a science fiction movie. And that's where the term brainwashing comes from. No one had ever talked about brainwashing in America. But in China, the process of taking criminals and reforming them in Chinese communist jails was called thought reform. The Maoist teaching was that if you committed a crime, it was because you had a bad political line. And so you engaged in the thought reform process to make restitution, to come to understand the belief that had led you to commit your crime. And you can actually read about this. There's Americans who underwent it. There's a very good book called Prisoners of the Revolution. It was written by a guy who I believe taught at Harvard. Prisoners of the Revolution, Mao, prison. If I can find it. Prisoners of the Revolution. I can find the PDF of it. It's actually quite a very, very good book by an American who underwent thought reform in a Chinese prison. If I can just find this book, right? They don't want you to Google this kind of thing. Prisoners of the Revolution. Prisoners of Revolution. Where is this book? I am trying to find this book, right? What was the name of the man who lived through it? American memoir. I actually want to find this because it's actually very important. Of this American who had lived through that experience. Wow, I am having trouble finding this. I read this book a long time ago. I had a PDF of it. Yeah, and it's actually a very, very good book. Yeah, it was called American Prisoners of the Revolution. What was that book called? Now I really want to find this book because there used to be a PDF of it. It's very interesting. Was it American Prisoners of the Revolution? Is that the name of the book? No, that is a Chinese book. This is absolutely crazy. No, that's about the, this is actually very, very crazy. Prisoner of the Revolution. This is really wild. I need to find out what this book is, right? Wow. And there's even an audio recording of the author of it. This is very, very crazy. Why am I having such a hard time finding this book? Okay, American Memoir of Thought Reform in China. This is absolutely crazy. Prisoners of Liberation, Alan Rickett. That's what it's called. Prisoners of Liberation, Alan Rickett. Okay, Prisoners of Liberation, Alan Rickett. All right, I'm going to get you the PDF here, right? We spent a long time trying to find out about it. Here it is, Prisoners of Liberation by Alan Rickett. You can read the book. Thank you. Thanks for your patience, everybody. Prisoners of Liberation by Alan Rickett. Here you go. Here's the link, right? It's an important book, right? But it basically documents this guy was an American spy in China, and he was arrested, and he underwent thought reform. And it's an important piece, right? Right? Prisoners of Liberation by Alan Rickett. Yeah, that's the book. But anyhow, back to the main point. So during the Korean War, a number of American GIs were taken captive. And a number of them confessed to having committed war crimes, which there were horrendous war crimes against the Korean people during the Korean War. And a lot of them became communists. And there was a whole lot of research done about why it was. Why did this happen? But basically what it got down to was that these guys, a lot of them, had a black and white worldview. Communists were all bad. America was all good. And so all it took was the shocking experience of getting taken prisoner. And they would get them in isolation, separate from anybody else, where they just had their interrogator. And they would show them evil things the American government had done. Lynching in the South, war crimes against the Korean people. And of course, they would at first say, that's just communist lies. You're lying to me. But they would prove to them. They'd show them the New York Times. They'd show them evidence this was true. And then these guys would crack and become communists. And then they would take them out of the cell in isolation and put them in a cell with a bunch of other people. And they would read communist textbooks. They actually read, apparently, William Z. Foster's history of America, the outline political history of the Americas. And they would be quizzed on reading the communist textbooks. The whole cell would be rewarded based on how well they did on their quiz, on their test. And these guys would become communists. And it was very, very easy to do because these guys had a very black and white worldview. Their view had been that America was all good, the communists were all bad. All they had to do was show that that was not the case. Click. And so the other side must be right. But there were some GIs who didn't change their worldview. Why? Why did they not change their worldview? Because they already knew that America was not such a great place. They knew the dark side of America. They knew the ugly aspects of America. They had a more cynical view. And because they were already a bit cynical on America, when you showed them the pictures of lynching, they weren't shocked. They said, yeah, that's our country. When you showed them the crimes of the Americans, they'd say, yeah. And those guys were much harder to convince to become communists because they didn't have a black and white worldview. It wasn't a light switch, right? In their view, America was not all good. And so just proving that America was not all good wasn't enough to convince them to go over the other side. And if you read what was basically discovered by Project MKUltra and the CIA, is that rather than trying to convince people to be fanatical anti-communists, it was much better to get people into a state of ambiguity. And that that actually a lot of the LSD research, and I quote this in my book about Brian Thompson and the danger of an American years of lead. I actually quote this, that when they got people on LSD, they would develop a plague on both your houses mindset, where both sides were wrong. Who cares, right? And that mindset of both sides are wrong, that is much safer, because it doesn't lead to people being passionate and full of energy. It leads to people being demoralized. It leads to people saying, screw it, who cares? And especially if you then get people on drugs, they just kind of say, screw it, who cares? And that there's really a fight among the elite when it really gets down to it. This is the division among the elite. This is what the Western elite don't agree with, in particular the American elite. Some of the American elite believe that it is ultimately necessary to induce lassitude in order to stay at the top, in order to maintain dominance, in order to reduce the population and reduce consumption. They want to induce a huge amount of dispassionate, plague on both your houses, cynicism, hopelessness, demoralization. Whereas other sections of the American elite very much want people to be enthusiastic about America, want people to be enthusiastic about the American system. It's the greatest in the world, etc. There's basically two strategies about how to defeat communism. Roosevelt had said, okay, we'll let the industrial unions come into existence. We'll align with the Soviet Union against Hitler. The industrialists had said, no, we're going to crush the communists. We're going to have military spending. Those were two different strategies. And after the Second World War, when the Great Depression was over, when the USA had a booming economy, first you had McCarthyism. And McCarthyism was the industrialists. It was the industrialists, the military manufacturers and others. And they were saying, all right, we're going to crush the Communist Party. We're going to be fanatically anti-communist. And then there you have the Rockefellers that said, well, actually, the way to crush the communists, the way to maintain our power, is to just loosen everything up. Have a sexual revolution, have a drug revolution, get everybody into a state of, we don't know what to believe, plague on both your houses, and really push degrowth, depopulation, Malthusianism, and we'll stay at the top of the world forever. And that second worldview, right? That worldview of let's not build a fanatical anti-communist movement, but instead let's get everyone into a cynical state of plague on both your houses. That view represents the ultra-rich and the ultra-monopolies. And that strategy is the more effective evil. And it's taken me a long time to realize this. And it doesn't match. It does not match what we've been told. But ultimately, social control and preventing solid opposition is much more effective by means of inducing lassitude, by keeping people from being passionate, getting people to be very cynical, getting people to, be on drugs all the time, getting people to be crazily sexual and all of that. All of that is a very, very effective way of reducing people to being lab rats who can be controlled. And it leads to pessimism and hopelessness. And it's very effective for stabilizing the world. Right? There was a novel that was published before the Second World War called Brave New World. And it's a dystopian novel, but it's about a future society where people are on drugs all the time. And they're drugged out and stupid. And this guy who lives in the rural areas, this guy who lives out on an Indian reservation, goes to the Brave New World and he's constantly trying to talk to the people, and he's read Shakespeare, and he's excited about things, and the people are all just completely drugged up and stupid. They're just walking around drugged up and stupid, being socially engineered by the elite. You read Brave New World. What's interesting in Brave New World is all the characters have communist names, right? You know, there's a woman named Polly Trotsky, Bernard Marx, right? They all have communist names, but at the same time, they worship Henry Ford, and they go around making the sign of the T, right? Instead of the sign of the cross, the sign of the T for the Model T Ford. Right? This is Brave New World, the novel by Aldous Huxley. And it creates kind of a dystopia where, you know, it's this ultra modern world where people are drugged up all the time, where people are stupid all the time, and they can't relate to Shakespeare, and they have no conception of world history. They're not very smart, and they're just drugged up and stupid all the time. And they go to movies that are just ugly sex and violence all the time, and they're drugged up and walking around in a daze, basically, as a mechanism for controlling them. And people are born in laboratories rather than being birthed by human mothers. They're born in laboratories, and it's this kind of dark eugenics future. And that the guy from the Native American reservation who's walking around, he's a real human being who has experienced real feelings and real pain. And his experience is very, very different. And he's saying, you know, you guys are not human. You're not experiencing what it's like to really be human. You're just living in this drugged up, hypnotized state of being. And you're just not experiencing the real range of human emotions. It's a very, very powerful book. But Aldous Huxley was somebody from the elite, right? I mean, he was somebody among the elite. And, you know, I mean, he was out of Ivy League schools, and he understood the conversations that were going on there. And then his book, The Doors of Perception, became almost a required text for the drug culture of the 1960s, right? It was a study he did of hallucinogens that became, you know, it was a book glorifying hallucinogens, basically, that became just widely studied and widely, you know, worshipped by the 60s drug culture. But Aldous Huxley, that novel he wrote he was kind of shedding light on what was being discussed. And if you look at what the Fabian Society was talking about, right? You know, and if you look at what was being discussed by you know, various organizations at the time among the elite, you read H.G. Wells and his work, and you know, you look at what, you know, the entities, the Round Table Group and others, those kind of groups that were more liberal in a sense. They were for birth control. They were for the sexual revolution. They were certainly skeptical and critical of traditional religion and patriotism, etc. But they very much were dreaming up a kind of totalitarianism in which humanity would be stripped of its ability to be passionate about anything, but would exist in a state of cynicism and lassitude, right? And that is very much what you can call them, the Eastern establishment, the World Business Forum, the globalists, the ultra rich. That's what they believe, right? You read Ferdinand Lundberg and his book Rockefeller Syndrome. The ultra rich are not communists, right? And the John Birch Society and the ultra conservatives, they all think they're communists. They're not communists. They want a very controlled society, and they want to reduce the population. They're very, very open about wanting to reduce the population. Very, very open about that. They want to drive down the population, and they want to carry out regime change. They want to overthrow Russia and China and any section of the world they can't control. And they want to stay at the top of the world. And in order to do that, they want to drive down the population, drive down living standards, stop economic growth so that they stay at the top. And that is very much the division among the elite. Most of the rich and powerful just want to make money. But the ultra rich, since at least the Roosevelt time, have been kind of dreaming up schemes where through a highly controlled society, people can be reduced to a state of lassitude. You'll own nothing, and you'll be happy about it. You'll live in a pod. You'll eat bugs. You won't reproduce. Living standards will go down. The population will decrease, and we can stabilize the system. Right? That has been very much the view of the ultra rich for a long time. right, is by utilizing lassitude, by getting people not to be super passionate in defense of the system, because then they might be super passionate about something else if they change their mind, but rather getting people into a state of mind where they're just cynical, hopeless, everything's bad, there is no hope, taking lots of, that is a way to control people. And this is the Malthusian solution, but it's not just Malthusianism. Malthusianism is the idea that we need to reduce the population, we need to reduce consumption, limited resources, etc. That's Malthusianism. But it's beyond Malthusianism. It is a mechanism of social control. It's about weakening people. It's about turning people into addicts. The most easy person to control is an addict, right? An addict is dependent on something. If you take away that something, the addict is desperate to get it, and they'll do what you want. It's about getting people into a state of being where they are very, very easily controlled. That is ultimately what our elite are trying to do. And it is a mechanism of social engineering, and it is much more liberal. And it's more effective, but it's expensive. It takes a long time. It doesn't pan out the immediate results. And that's what's going on. And the fight among the elite, the rise of the new right in Europe, the rise of Trump in the United States, the military-industrial complex has never wanted this. They want people to be passionate about the military, passionate about America, want to go die for America. Well, you can't do that if you're drugged up and pessimistic and hopeless, can you? Right? And the elite, it's the same in Britain and France and all these places, right? And it's their strategy for social control is kind of reducing human beings to being easily controlled, passionless, energyless, hopeless creatures. That is their idea of how to wage social control. But at the end of the day, it's all to deal with this exact same problem. And I may be repetitive on these streams, and I may bring it up over and over and over again, because you need to hear it. The problem is that we have an economic system where abundance creates poverty. And with the computer revolution, we have created more abundance than ever before. And I'm going to put on this math video that I've made many, many times. The capitalist mode of production has a problem that has never existed before anywhere, which is poverty created by abundance, poverty amid plenty.
Explain what needs to be explained, what used to be considered Marxism 101, about why it is that our Western capitalist economy is crashing and burning. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to do some math. And I hate math. Do you know why I hate math? Because I grew up in America. I went to public school in the United States of America. So I am going to, at risk of embarrassing myself, because math was never my best subject, I'm going to do some mathematics here on the board for you to explain the problem.
I very much enjoyed Caleb's speech.
So if you are creating a product, right? If you're a factory owner, you're making a product, you are going to need the material through which that product is made, the manufacturing materials. So that'll be A.
The simple equation you put forward to explain the crisis of overproduction and the falling rate of profit.
And you're probably going to need to transport the product to where it's sold. That's B.
It broke down where your money goes.
You're also going to have to pay your labor costs. Labor costs are represented by C.
Explanations of those concepts that people are able to understand.
Then when consumers purchase the product, they're going to pay a final price. And that final price is D. However, there's a problem with that.
I like the fact that he framed it that way to make it very clear.
Which is that the capitalist can't change how much A costs. He can't change how much B costs. So the profit of the capitalist can only be extracted from the value put into it by the worker. And this is the basis of Marxism, the understanding of surplus value.
I've never seen it explained so simply anywhere. I've never been able to explain it that simply.
So C, the labor value, is divided. You have C1, which is what the worker actually gets paid. And then you have C2, which is the profit that the capitalist makes. And it all adds up to D, which is the final cost of the product. Now, the way people in the United States who talk about Marxism generally talk about this is they say, well, this is unfair. They say the worker is not getting paid the full value of his labor. But they're missing one of the most important points, which is not just that it's unfair and then people argue, well, what about the employer? He put up the money, doesn't he deserve to be? That's all a distraction. Because the important thing to understand is this. C1 is always going to be less than D. The wages paid out to the worker are never enough to buy back the product that he produces. There is always more products created than there are wages paid out to the worker. And this is the built-in problem of capitalism, the problem of overproduction. And it is always there in the capitalist economy. It never goes away. And they have invented all kinds of crazy mechanisms to try and deal with the problem of overproduction. Part of the reason that the US government has purchased billions and billions of dollars worth of cheese only to bury it in a cave in Springfield, Missouri, is to deal with this problem. It is an ongoing present problem, and it's a problem acknowledged by most capitalist economists. John Maynard Keynes said the problem was underconsumption rather than overproduction, but he was pointing to the same problem. The military-industrial complex in the United States is an effort to deal with this problem, to keep spending going. There's all kinds of mechanisms that they've invented to try and resolve this problem, but it gets worse. What is the capitalist always trying to do? He wants to maximize the amount of profit he makes. And one of the main ways they do that is with what's called labor-saving technology. Get rid of workers and replace workers with machines. As they eliminate workers from the process of production, as there's fewer and fewer workers involved, as machines take the place of workers, the role of C in production decreases. There's a little bit of a problem with that. As C goes down, C2 also goes down, right? As C decreases, C2 also decreases. And as the role of the worker in production is reduced, the rate of profit that the capitalist makes goes down. And this is called the tendency of the falling rate of profit. Only human labor creates value. And this is something that Adam Smith acknowledged. This is something some of the popes even acknowledge. Human labor creates all value. And so when you reduce the role of human labor in production, the amount of value created decreases, and the ability of the capitalist to extract surplus value also decreases. So this causes the capitalist to have to churn out even more products because he's making less and less of a profit on the overall product. He's making less and less of a percentage, so he has to churn them out. So this problem of the worker never being able to buy back what he produces and more products being created than are necessary, this problem becomes exacerbated. And this points to what is understood to be the deeply...
Yeah, that is the problem, right? The problem is that we have an economic system that always produces more products than it pays out in wages. We can never afford to buy back what we make. And the more productive and the more technology advances, the bigger this problem gets. That is the underlying problem. Their solution to it is degrowth, right? If you destroy the productive forces, if you reduce the population, then as a result, you can reboot the economy with destruction. And that is the basis on which we continue to have economic crises. And the crisis we're in right now is because of the computer revolution, because it has never been so efficient to produce products like it is today. Never have we had a situation where it is so easy to produce products. Computers can do almost everything that human beings can do, and that should be a good thing. But it's not a good thing because it's leading to a situation where the amount of wages paid out is lower than ever before, and human labor power is decreased. The amount of value that is extracted from each product is lower than ever before. That's the problem, right? We are in a situation where the economy just can't get going again because of the fact that human technology has advanced. We have become so good at production. We have advanced technology so far that our economy is crashing and burning. right? And this doesn't make any sense. And there's all this fear of self-driving cars. Self-driving cars should be a great thing, but it would lead to millions of truck drivers out of work, millions of Uber drivers, millions of traffic court employees, state highway patrolmen. All kinds of people would lose their jobs. Why does that make any sense? Should we not have a rational society where technological advancement leads to more prosperity and wealth for all? Of course we should. But right now we have a highly irrational economic system. And ultimately, the solution is society taking control of the economy, rational central planning. And that's why China continues to rise. And that's why the BRICS countries continue to rise, is there are sections of the world that broke out of Western dominance and did so by having anti-colonial revolutions in which a popular state that led the anti-colonial struggle now runs the economy. And as a result, they can continue to grow because their economy is planned. But our economy is still centered around profit. Profits are in command. And as a result, the more technology advances, the more economic turbulence and instability we have. And the computer revolution has spawned a situation where economic turbulence and economic meltdown is almost permanent. They can't reboot because of this problem of the tendency of the falling rate of profit, of value crisis overproduction. That's the problem. Now, the ultra rich think that this can be solved with heavy-handed social control, inducing depopulation, stabilizing the economy by destroying the population, destroying consumption, just reducing everyone to amount of poverty. That's why they openly say this is what it's about. You listen to what they're saying. You listen to what's being said at the World Economic Forum. We don't need millions of people in the global assembly line, right? And so what do we do with them? How do they exist? Well, we've got to reduce them to living in a lot lower state of being. And we've got to reduce the population overall. We got to make sure they don't reproduce. This is all these horror stories that you hear about that the anti-globalist right highlights. They are dealing with an inherent problem of the capitalist economy. And it is this problem that is forcing the ultra rich, the Eastern establishment, the Rockefeller Round Table Group British Empire faction. That is what is forcing them to try and drive down the population and assert their dominance and will over the economy. And, I don't know, you want to talk about secret societies, you want to talk about wizards, you want to talk about the Illuminati, you can talk about whatever you want, but at the end of the day, there is a very well-organized faction among the elite who think that the capitalist economy and the Western system can remain dominant with these kind of heavy-handed controls. But there are lots of very wealthy people who don't like these plans because they cut into their profits. And the problem is that leftism, socialism and communism, leftist activism has largely been reduced to being the foot soldiers of the ultra-rich in their efforts to contain the lower levels of capital. In their efforts to force this agenda on the lower level capitalists, leftists are mobilized. Socialists and communists, they're not fighting for the workers to control the means of production. They are fighting to help the ultra monopolies control the lower levels. And that's what leftism has been reduced to. It is a movement funded by nonprofits and NGOs that goes out and fights the lower level capitalists, fights Donald Trump, fights the Alternative for Deutschland party, fights the Brexiters in Britain in order to make them accept what the ultra rich are dishing out. That's the problem. That is the problem. And that is what I have discovered through years of studying and trying to figure all this out and spending my entire adult life in communist groups and traveling around the world. That's the problem. However, there's another side to this, which is that around the world, the communist governments now align with industrialists and lower level capitalists. China, their economy it's run by the state, it's run by the Chinese Communist Party, but there's lots of private companies that are part of an overall plan to raise the economy. that follow the party's direction. Russia, there's a lot of capitalists that are subsidized by the Russian government that are part of the Russian government's overall plan to make the country wealthier. And that communism around the world is basically a state. It's not the Soviet Union anymore. It's not a completely government-run economy. It's a state, a popular state that is aligned with an industrial middle class that is working as part of an overall plan to make the country more prosperous. That's what communism in our time is. It's not what it was during the Soviet times. It's not what Marx wrote about. That's what communism has basically evolved into. 21st century socialism, what they have in Venezuela, what they have in China, what they have in Iran. They call it not capitalism, but Islam. What they have in the Union of Sahel States with Ibrahim Traore is they have an anti-monopoly government, a government that is fighting ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron, and fighting on behalf of the nation against the big monopolies. That's what they have. They have a government that is working against the big monopolies and leads a coalition that includes labor unions, that includes small farmers, that includes industrialists, includes all kinds of people, and is centered around a very powerful state that organizes the economy to make sure there is long-term economic growth. That is the new alternative to capitalism around the world. And it is capitalism in a lot of ways. There's a lot of people making profits. There's a lot of all that. But there's an anti-monopoly government, and profit is not in command. The anti-monopoly state controls the banks, controls the natural resources, stabilizes the economy, and lends money strategically in the interest of the nation. Right? So this is the new system that has emerged. This is what 21st century socialism is. And that's why these countries continue to rise. And the irrationality of profits in command, and the fact the profit system cannot handle the problem of overproduction and the glut and the technological advances that we've seen over the past few years. That is the basis for the West destabilizing. This is what must be understood, and that there's a fight among the elite about how to deal with this crisis. On the one hand, they want to beat down the competitive countries around the world. On the other hand, they want to force the population here to take it, to take a weaker position. They want World War III. They want a low-wage police state. But the overwhelming majority of humanity does not want that and wants to resist and does not want their domination and wants their living standard to go up and wants a more prosperous life and wants to innovate and create. They don't want to become passionless, hopeless, and drugged up. Most of humanity wants to go out and build. And so we're at this turning point, and that is the basis for our movement, the Center for Political Innovation, and that is our understanding. And there's many layers here of understanding. And it is not simple what we're talking about here. This is some advanced stuff here. And that the people who argue with us, we get various people who argue with us, right? One layer of people who argue with us. One of the main objections we get, since we unfortunately, because we're not as popular as we should be, we still, seem to occupy communist spaces. And one common objection to our belief system and our understanding is you get a layer of people that I would call kindergarten communists. And what they do is they say, nuh-uh, that's not, nuh-uh, communism is when the workers control the means of production. And they're like way behind us, right? It's like, yes, Marx wrote about the workers and the capitalists, and then Lenin came along and said, well, capitalism is evolving into imperialism, and then out of imperialism we can build an anti-imperialism, and all of that. We're like way past that. Right. So that's one layer of people, the kindergarten communists. They just want to do the worker versus bosses thing. A lot of them don't support any actual existing socialist or communist government. They only want worker cooperatives. The workers are shareholders in a for-profit company. They're way behind us. Then you get a layer of people that agree with us on the issues, that are opposed to the wars, that are opposed to Israel in a lot of cases, but at the same time, they think the answer is free market capitalism. And this is much more widespread. You get a lot of Trump kind of people that are with us. They don't want the wars. America first, not Israel first. They do want a government that is concerned about making the economy better, but they think the free market can create it. And they think that the problem that we have in America is that we just don't have the free market. And that if we just got rid of the Federal Reserve Bank, if we just deregulated everything and privatized everything, the market would magically solve the problem. Well, they don't understand that the problems are rooted in profit. The problems are rooted in the instability of the profit economy and this problem of glut, G-L-U-T, glut, and the irrationality of the market, and that the Federal Reserve Bank and all the crony capitalism that they are objecting to was set up as a means of trying to stabilize a naturally unstable system. That's a much more widespread objection. We maybe don't hear it as much because we're not engaging with real people as much. We're stuck in a communist bubble. We hear the first objection, kindergarten communism. That's the first objection. But as we expand and as we get to the real population, that objection, that objection seems to be the primary objection out there, is that many people that are opposed to the emerging low-wage police state, that are opposed to the danger of a new world war, they understand we have a government run by an elite that is trying to forcibly degrow and impoverish us all. They still believe that somehow that elite is communism. And in some cases, they believe that elite is coming from China, which is crazy. That elite spends billions of dollars trying to overthrow the Chinese government, spends billions, positioning the military. They want us to go to have World War III against China. They're not controlled by China. But they believe that that elite is somehow controlled by China, and that elite is somehow what they want is communism. They think that communism and Malthusianism are the same thing. And that is a really common objection. And that is probably the primary objection that we have to deal with. But the objection doesn't have an answer to what we just laid out about the economic problem, right? There's no understanding of that, right? As far as they're concerned, that economic problem doesn't exist. And most of the people, unfortunately, that we do get to engage with and explain these ideas to, who hear this, it's just too much, right? And their response is kind of, oh, I just can't, they just can't handle it, right? Because their whole worldview is based on Democrats are communists. Their whole worldview is based on the Soviet Union and Democrats are the same thing. Their whole worldview is that capitalism is the answer, and the problems in America is just that we don't have real capitalism. And they agree with us on the issues. They are opposed to the wars. They are opposed to the civil liberties, and they are angry about the economic suffering. But they just can't swallow that pill that the problem is that we have a government that works in the interest of the big monopolies, and that the left are their foot soldiers, and that the governments around the world that are resisting them have the same goal as us, right? That the reason China broke free from Western domination was to create economic growth because the British Empire was keeping China poor. The reason Russia broke free was to have economic growth. And under Stalin's leadership, Russia became an industrial superpower, wiped out illiteracy, became one of the most powerful, industrial countries in the world, right? That under Gaddafi, Libya had the highest life expectancy on the African continent. Nicaragua in Central America is doing very, very well because they've broken out of this. That the countries that are breaking free, sometimes led by communists, but not always. I mean, in some cases, right? In Iran, they're led by Shia Muslims. In Nicaragua, they call it Christianity, socialism, and solidarity. The countries that break out of Western dominance, these countries do it for the purpose of trying to have economic growth. And that now those governments tend to promote small business owners and industrialists that function as part of an overall central plan. This doesn't match what these people know. These people understand communism is when the government controls everything and crushes small business, and that's what the Democrats are. And capitalism is when we have economic growth. That's what they understand. And so this is too much for them. And this is kind of the weird situation that we're in. Ultimately, the strategy that we have to employ is twofold. It is top and bottom organizing. On the one hand, we have to make ourselves useful in struggles within the ruling class. And when this lower level of capital that is fighting to raise its people, to maintain its right to make profits and resisting the degrowth vision of the ultra rich, we need to be on their side. We need to oppose their wars. We need to fight for their civil liberties. And on the other hand, we need to just build our own organization and teach our own ideas, and that there are people who are receptive to these ideas. They're not a huge chunk of the population, but they exist. And their perspective is, you know, important, and that we need to build a solid core of people who can understand these conceptions while we make ourselves relevant and useful in bigger struggles and bigger divisions, right? And that this is a strategy that can be employed. All of this I put forward in the Where is America Going book, right? I put it forward in this book, and I've divided this book up now into shorter books. What is a counter gang? What is Bonapartism? AI is not the problem, right? I have broken this book up into smaller little pamphlets, but this is the worldview. This is the worldview that I put forward in there, that there is a fight among the elite, and it is over stabilizing capitalism by means of social control, and that it is that Eastern establishment that wants a very well-engineered capitalism, social engineering, and degrowth versus the industrialists who just want to grow, and the countries around the world that have broken out of Western imperialism. That ultimately we need an anti-monopoly coalition against the big monopolies. We need a government that is strong enough it will break the power of the big bankers and control the economy in order to ensure economic growth. And that's a tough pill for many of the opposition in America to understand, because they are used to believing that free markets magically just solve the problem. They don't. They just don't. Right? I mean, and that free market propaganda is, I mean, they say things that are absurd. That there would be no monopolies if it wasn't for the government. Well, the government, the big monopolies themselves have created antitrust laws to try and prevent monopolies. Right. And that there is a lot of economic malarkey out there that tries to say that we can just that the market just magically solves things. Right. So this is deeper understanding. Right. I know what I'm doing. Right. And there are a lot of jokers out there, and there are a lot of confused people out there, and that we are carving out something new, and we are the innovationist movement. I was a communist for many years, but I believed in God, and I was optimistic. I wasn't destructive. And I had kind of an awakening in 2015. And when I got back and I was organizing, I started saying things like out of the movement to the masses. And it took me a long time to finally just realize we can't be communists, because communism is tied in with all these destructive impulses. And communism as a brand and as a movement is dead. It is a dead brand, right? And that we just have to organize. We have to fight the emerging low-wage police state. We have to fight the danger of a new world war. We have to make ourselves useful to the rich and powerful who want to oppose this overall agenda of degrowth. And at the same time, we just have to build our own organization. And this is not an easy task, but it's what we must do. And that's been my understanding. And that if you don't have this breakthrough, you are reduced to begging for a place in leftism, which I gave up doing a long time ago, right? And I see people doing it, and it's pathetic, right? The left is, at this point, completely controlled, right? There is not a shred of anti-imperialism in leftism anymore. I mean, there's just not a shred of it. Leftism has basically just turned into a wing of globalism. Who's the leader of the Palestine movement at this point? Greta Thunberg, right? Greta Thunberg, the queen of degrowth, right? Because the global elite have realized that, what Israel's doing is bad optics and PR. They had the same woman, the same young teenager that they sent around to promote degrowth and to oppose economic expansion. They now made her the face of the Palestine movement, right? I agree with the Palestine movement. I am opposed to what Israel is doing. But the Palestine movement is at this point just kind of controlled opposition and optics. And all real opposition to the power structure is coming from dissident MAGA. It's coming from people like Rand Paul, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Tucker Carlson, Thomas Massey. They're the ones that actually are opposing these moves. The left, the members of Congress, Bernie, all of them are really pretty much silent when it comes to the threats on Venezuela. All of them cheered for the FBI. They said nothing about the Uhuru case. They let the FBI target the Uhuru movement. And so we have to build the anti-monopoly coalition. We have to build up our own ranks. And that's bottom organizing, is we just have to have workshops, and we have to win people to this perspective. And top organizing is that we then have to deploy ourselves to be useful in these struggles, right? We have to disrupt the No Kings rallies and say, hands off Venezuela. We need to rally and support, loudly calling for the peace talks. We need to be in the streets saying, thank you, Tulsi Gabbard, and cheering for Tulsi Gabbard, revealing that Russiagate was a hoax, right? We need to find ways that when there are divisions among the elite, we intervene loudly and become an important fighting force for the anti-monopolists and the forces that oppose monopoly, while building up our own ranks and our own ideology and our own understanding, right? And that's, neither of these things are easy to do, and it's difficult. It is an uphill battle. It's an uphill battle, but nobody is doing what we are doing. Nobody has a strategy, right? Nobody has a strategy than we do, right? The communist groups, their strategy is whatever the Democrats are doing, they do it louder. They try to organize. If they're PSL, they try to organize the protests. If they're the Communist Party, they register people to vote. They are just on the side of the ultra-rich. And most of the MAGA movement is totally confused, totally confused. A lot of them do support Israel, but even the ones who don't, they don't know what to do. And, you know, they're very confused. They don't have a strategy for building a movement. But there was an important moment called Rage Against the War Machine, where we very effectively intervened and made ourselves a relevant part of the conversation. There are situations now, like, for example, the persecution of Dr. Hak Jahan in South Korea. That's an important case. The Uhuru case is a very important case, right? You know, there are moments where we are able to see a crack and intervene, right? When you are working in construction, they say, you know, before you nail, you make a wedge, right? You take your nail and you stick it in there and you make a wedge. And then you take your hammer and you pound the nail in. We have to find wedges. We have to find wedges within the system, right? Moments where there's an opening where we can then take the nail, put it into the wedge, and pound it in, right? But you have to find a wedge. You have to find a wedge. And that is top organizing, is finding a wedge and intervening and making it clear that we are very helpful and important allies to the forces that are resisting the efforts of the ultra-rich to impose their degrowth agenda and their highly controlled capitalism, their degrowth, Malthusian, highly controlled capitalism. We need to make ourselves useful in that fight, while we build up our own ranks and teach people this unique understanding. And that is what we are doing. And it's called top and bottom organizing. And that is our perspective. And that is the conflict within the elite. And I hope that this was educational for people. I hope that people gained some insights into this about what CPI is trying to do, why we're organizing. I hope you'll join us at our event coming up in New Jersey. It's going to be great. I hope you'll get involved in our activities. We're doing great stuff. We're in the streets. We're organizing. We've got a lot going on. We are figuring out how to provide transportation to people in the area. Right? We're doing all kinds of stuff. So I hope you get involved. I know David Fox appreciates this understanding. So do many others. We have an understanding that is very unique, but it's also very important. And on the basis of this, we are building a movement, building an organization. I look at what's going on right now. President Putin of Russia is in India, and they just opened RT India. Big studio for RT has just opened in India. That shows how strong the new economy is, that there is enough of a wing of the Indian capitalists and the Indian economy that is pro-Russian, that an entire RT facility has just opened up in India. That shows you this new economy is the future. A lot of great things are happening, and I'm paying very close attention to Kirill Dmitriev and the talk of the Bering Sea Tunnel, and a lot is happening, right? Putin has been talking about how there are many American corporations that are very excited to get back into Russia. And think about that. If they're investing in Russia, that's going to make them more sympathetic to the rising new economy and at odds with the Eastern establishment that wants to crush Russia, right? So we have an important role to play as a political movement that is pro-growth, pro-humanity, and against globalism, imperialism, and has this unique advanced understanding. So we've got to build our own movement. So join the Center for Political Innovation, get involved. And those are my opening remarks for tonight. I hope this was helpful.